Hi, everybody. I guess before I start talking about my collection, just a little background about me. I do have an illustration background, but 4 years ago, kind of started a new chapter in my life, going to the university, and not really knowing what I wanted to talk about or have my art converse about. I think coincidentally, our president changed, and that really kind of impacted me a lot. And so I've really focused on identity politics for my time at University of Michigan. And this being my senior year, which coincidentally coincided with Harwood's exhibition for the past good year or so, I've been really working on a collection that talks about identity politics in America, Asian American politics, and just how I feel living in America now. My time in the university really kind of drew me towards textile and fashion design. I think there is something to be said about identity and everyone's identity in America through the clothing we choose on a daily basis and how we specifically want to present ourselves and have others see us. So I created a collection this year, which I titled 1942, which specifically pertains to the Japanese internment camps in World War II. I thought this was a unique time period to emphasize just because, one, I felt like it could relate to my identity being Japanese American myself, but also just seeing this kind of cyclical pattern that American politics make on creating an enemy or an other to draw or direct all our hate towards. In the 1940s, Japanese Americans specifically were seen as terrorists, and the livelihood for Japanese Americans was kind of terrible, and it was really drawn due to the enemies Americans had at the time. Now, move 80 years from now, which historically I think is a really short time period, demographic that was seen as terrorists, as seen as problem minorities, as seen as trouble. Now, statistically, Asian Americans are one of the highest demographics for socioeconomic income, education rates, and honestly are kind of seen nowadays as model minorities. So that stark contrast between the before and now present, I thought was really worth conversing about, especially since I think several themes of internment camps have been seen now at the Mexican borders, Mexican-American border, sorry, and also the kind of dilution that the American government has made about the obscurities and all the atrocities happening at the Mexican-American border are the same themes that you could have seen in the 1940s. So basically my garment tries to bring in both American and Japanese identity. I use really Americana frames for my garments. So I chose denim jackets and a denim jumpsuit, which is really iconic by celebrities back then. You look at like Marlon Brando, of course, other like icons like Rosie the Riveter, they all really embrace denim as this like rugged Americana look and vibe. Alongside like the 1940s is kind of seen to some as like one of America's greatest generations and time periods. But ultimately that's because they overlooked and they kind of hid all the obscure atrocities back then. In turn, moving forced migration of 120,000 Japanese American citizens, I thought it was kind of outrageous. And at the time, all the documentation and footage of the internment camps was all hidden and censored by the American government to kind of keep the propagandist perception of America alive as long as World War II was still going on. So I thought it was really important to kind of use these pop cultural references as my back frame, my structure for these garments. On top of that, I got inspired by two Japanese crafts, one being boro stitch, which is the practice of using different scrap fabrics to mend your once damaged but now new pieces of clothing. So instead of throwing away a shirt or a kimono or whatever back in the day, they would actually find beauty and find more value in actually mending it and owning it and holding on to it. And the other craft I took inspiration from was called kintsugi. And that's a Japanese craft for pottery where they mend broken pottery with gold lacquer. So kind of highlighting the complexity of an identity. Both of these crafts I thought were a good conversation to include in trying to redefine this American past and show how complex identity politics have been and still are nowadays. And then I lined each garment with UV printed photos from interment photos taken by Dorothy Lange, which is a very famous American photographer, who all her photos at the time were commissioned by the US government, but were held censored until the World War II was finished. So that other sense of like censorship and ownership I felt was like important to contribute and have part of my dialogue. So I had the lining be really more blatantly political, just because that for the viewer is what you touch, it's what you interact with. On top of, I wanted to have this ladder experience with my clothing where from an outside view, the aesthetic and the beauty of the crafts I decided to use really drew in the viewer. And only once you got drawn in and you got hooked, would you understand the complexity and the deeper conversation that was being made by me, I guess. I took inspiration from other political textile artists, for example, like Ebony G. Patterson, who, if you guys don't know who she is, I recommend you look her up. She really talks about the shootings of Black Americans, but she does it in an aesthetically beautiful way to kind of have this conversation with those who, from an outside view of political artists, would really get drawn away from or want to just not engage with. She uses this aesthetical beauty as a way to kind of bring in the other, the people who have maybe more conservative views towards racial politics or identity in America, how to bring them in and have that conversation with those who usually would not have a contribution normally. So that was kind of the thought process going into it. I documented it in New Mexico, which I felt was important. New Mexico is one of several states that were used for the internment camps. Also, New Mexico has that very spacious, isolated feeling that I think really resonated with kind of the feeling back in the 1940s for Japanese Americans. So that's basically the thought process going into my collection. Yeah.